So, we were talking about Mahler. Big surprise, huh? Hi, I'm Robert McBride of All Classical Portland. This is Carlos Kalmar, Music Director of the Oregon Symphony.
Good evening.
Who probably knows more about Mahler's music than anyone else in the room.
Actually, I already forgot a lot of Mahler. The thing is, I always had, first of all, pretty much every conductor there is has some very particular relationship with Mahler, because Mahler always is such a great challenge, and I would say for the most part, Mahler makes you look really good. And it helps. And it's such a think of gigantic proportions, with the exception of Symphony No. 4, that it's something conductors are like salivating to do their entire life. Probably the same with Richard Strauss, but Richard Strauss didn't write symphonies, aside from Aus Italien, which is very early, and Domestica, which is very late. And well, there is, the Alpine.
A conductor and I were talking about Richard Strauss some years ago, and he said that conducting that stuff makes him feel like a god. Is it like that with Mahler, or?
No. I don't feel any of that. I actually don't have any of that, like, whoa, I'm elevated. Because if I would really think about that for 1 second, which I don't, I probably would come up with solutions like, I feel like a god when I conduct Mozart. Which
More
is,
than Mahler.
Or probably Schubert. Some of Schubert. The thing is, I can imagine that my esteemed colleague to whom you talked just talked about the power, the richness, the big cake with lots of whipped cream that Strauss does so well. And if I would even dare to think about that, I would think about the composers who are so way up there that you get closer to the it.
If you could ask Mahler something, what would you ask him? Is there any big question in one of his scores that you've seen? It's no, wait a minute, what does this mean?
Oh, no.
Nothing like that?
No.
Anything else?
I would
philosophy?
say, I don't ask questions like that. Huh? Because I myself, it has something to do with, of course, I'm very curious. But two things. First of all, Mahler was very specific in what he wrote. So, no, you don't need to ask, just look at the score. And also, in terms of interpretation in general and what Mahler specifically does, who writes so many things, I just am always very distant.
You just don't have enough ego.
No, what I mean is I'm distant in the sense that I don't like to explain things that happen so much.
Neither did he. He got really annoyed at people always pestering him to come up with programs to explain what his symphonies were about.
Yeah, and
he described that as a crutch for a cripple. I think that's in your program notes. That's a good line.
Yeah, probably. And I think it doesn't need explanation, because at the end of the day, you can come up probably with a fairly sound explanation for the first couple of symphonies, but already with some of the fourth, you get in trouble. I mean, what the hell does that mean? I mean, are you going to come up with one thing, or are you going to come up with something you want to ask him, what do you mean by that? Well, Mahler probably would have had an explanation, but probably he would have thought, why do you ask me that? Look at the score. It's all there. Don't ask.
So leave the stupid questions to guys like me. I was looking at some of the music backstage because there's some off-stage music making And it says on the score, "In the distance." He loved that effect. I like that too. So there will be brass and percussion off stage, and a big chorus and a couple of soloists. I was really impressed reading about these soloists. Their bios are really something. It's nice that you can get talent like that here.
Well, actually, the great thing is that I don't know who in this room was here and saw Persephone last
Just
week.
last week. Doesn't that seem longer ago than 1 week?
Which was last century, kind of. But Paul, our tenor soloist, who was so fantastic, of course, read and said, "Hey, Carlos, you're doing Mahler second, and I saw that you got the soloists which are probably the best you can get in the market." And I was like, oh. Because I thought...
See, if you had more of an ego, you would have said, "Oh yeah, I know, I did that."
Yeah. No, the thing is, I knew I actually had worked with our soprano, Tamara Wilson, and so I knew that, yeah, tell her to come to the concert, it will be fine. We did rehearsal, nonetheless. And Elizabeth Schonka, you only read the bio, and then she opens her mouth, and it's like, ooh, it makes you smile immediately in rehearsal.
I was thinking about Persephone today and the ways in which it is similar to the music that we'll hear tonight, because Persephone had to do with the inevitable change of the seasons and the ongoing cycle of winter and spring and life and death and renewal, which is exactly what Mahler was getting at in his Resurrection Symphony. It's not a resurrection in a Christian sense, but in a larger sense that everything lives and dies and these cycles happen. And this time of year is the perfect time to hear this music because the stuff is coming up in the garden. All those miracles are happening again. The bees are back, and it's just, this is the time of year to think about this.
I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. And the point has to be made that the Resurrection Symphony by Gustav Mahler has nothing to do with religion. Absolutely.
He was
or let's
pretty
say
agnostic.
very minor. I mean, it has actually not something to do with his personal view, because actually Mahler was Jewish and converted later to Catholicism to make his life easier, mostly, which didn't work, but that's a different story. And essentially the resurrection idea in the symphony is very loosely, you can tie it to the resurrection idea of Persephone, because it's the idea of everything that needs to die to be reborn. And in this pretty larger-than-life symphony, something like this happens, because actually in the symphony we start with dying. The first monstrosity of a movement is actually called Totenfeier.
Funeral rites.
Funeral rites, thank you.
It's intense.
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
Oh. It reminds me of something. I meant to say, 3 nights I meant to say last weekend when we were talking about Persephone doing this, that on Thursdays at 3 last week we had 4 cellists from this orchestra. But I'm going to say it now because you can still hear that. It's in the audio archive at allclassical.org. They were great. They were so good. That was number 126 in Thursdays at 3 of my favorite shows so far. But we digress. I digress, sorry.
Well, it's great that you speak about your shows, because I actually am a great fan of you and what you do in All Classical. It's always so...
I know. Somebody has to have an ego up here, right? All right, where were we? You're talking about the seasons. Okay, how many people here have a fear of death, fear of dying? Wow, nobody's raising their hands.
It's one of the, I think it's one of those questions that you just don't want to answer.
You don't want to admit
public.
to it?
And I think like, well,
I think, you know, fear of dying is a pretty universal thing, whether you want to admit it or not. But it seems to me like a complete waste of time. Because you're going to die. We're all going to die. Everything dies. From the tiniest amoeba to the greatest of the great whales, everything dies. So anytime you spend fearing that, is wasted life.
Well, the thing,
So
because
resurrection,
we are
what
going
this
to
is.
make we are going to make the tie to Mahler anyway. I believe that it's not so much the fear of death, it's the fear of the uncertainty. Because yes, we all know here we are going to die one day or the other, but we don't know when, how, and unless you have a lot of faith, we really don't know what happens after. So
That's the excitement.
okay, it's a nice way to put it.
But I was reminded of that listening to this music today, this Resurrection Symphony by Mahler, and reading about it and reading the words. There's this oft-told story that Mahler was at the funeral of a fellow conductor, composer, Hans von Bülow, and a choir sang a hymn that set words about resurrection by a German writer named Klopstock.
Yeah.
And Mahler had been looking for a text because he wanted to do a choral finale in his symphony the same way that Beethoven had in his Ninth. And he said, that's it. I'll do that. So he uses some of that, and then he adds some of his own words too. And that got me thinking, where is that hymn? Who set that hymn that Mahler heard at that funeral? Does that music still exist? I'd love to know what it sounds like.
I am sure it still exists, because I'm sure that scholars who wrote books about Mahler's second found out what did Mahler actually hear. Yeah. The funny thing about that story is that this was the funeral for Hans von Bülow. Hans von Bülow was one of the greatest pianists of his time, and undoubtedly even more famous as one of the greatest conductors of his time. He was one of the very early music directors of Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. And there is, before this event happened, to which probably a lot of very important musicians in Europe went, the kind of funeral festivities, if you want to call it as such, for Hans von Bülow. There is a relationship between Mahler and Bülow. Because, first of all, Bülow was revered amongst conductors. So it was somebody Mahler knew, and he also knew him personally. And a couple of, I don't know, months, maybe a year earlier, Mahler visited Hans von Bülow and played. At that time, Mahler had written only the first movement, this funeral thing. And he played this funeral movement for Bülow, and most of the time he was, of course, very concentrated in playing it correctly and looking, and every time he looks up, he sees Bülow with his hands over his ears. And he says, should I continue? And Bülow said, yeah, go on, go on. And Mahler gets to the end, and Bülow says, if that is still music, then I don't understand anything anymore. Also, looking at this movement in particular, Bülow said that it makes music like Tristan and Isolde by Richard Wagner look like a tiny opera by Mozart. I'm not sure about that assessment, but
so Bülow conducted the premiere of Tristan and Isolde.
I mean, the thing with Hans von Bülow, which goes even further, is, so I told you about how revered he was. He was also married at some point in his life to a very interesting woman. He was, as a pianist, a student of Franz Liszt. He married the daughter of Liszt, Cosima, only to lose Cosima to that composer, meaning Richard Wagner. So Richard Wagner kind of, I mean, it was not like that, but it sounds good. Richard Wagner stole Cosima from the arms of Hans von Bülow. And then Cosima was, of course, for the remainder of her life, the wife of Richard Wagner. Nonetheless, Hans von Bülow conducted premieres of two of the greatest operas, Tristan and Meistersinger, of Richard Wagner. And absolutely, despite maybe certain private grudge, he recognized the talent of. So this is the story of how things come together, and then we get to Gustav Mahler and this story about Mahler playing for Bülow and not being very successful. This was, I mean, here Mahler was of course destroyed, and then Bülow got very sick, traveled to Cairo just to kind of improve his health, and died 5 days later. And when his body arrived, I think it was in Hamburg, and was put to rest, that is when this festivity, this church service happened, in which Mahler heard the resurrection chorale. And that, of course, the resurrection chorale is the feature, and this is the kind of to be recognized music in this symphony. However, so let's just take a little bit look at the interesting reality in this piece. So we already talked about the first movement, which roughly speaking is 22 minutes of very intense, sometimes very powerhouse music, and when it's not very powerful, it's incredibly moving and touching. And then comes movement 2 and 3, which are taken from songs. No, actually, movement 2 is not. Movement 2 is an andante that reminds you of an Austrian Ländler. And the reality, I mean, we are, see, the thing is, we just go to concert or we conduct concert, whatever, it doesn't matter what role, and we don't think about the impact that this might have had on the people at the time. So, because we actually can go home, probably before you come tonight, and just listen to Mahler too, and you sample it, and you think, this is absolutely fantastic, I want to go to hear the Oregon Symphony. Do it, fine. And then you don't think about the fact that, so there is this powerhouse of this first movement, and then immediately following, there is something that is very delicate, very light, reminds you of Ländler, which is the slower predecessor to the waltz.
Are the steps similar, do you know?
Since I can't dance, I have no idea. But in a way, there is such a huge disproportion between first and second movement, and recognizing that, Mahler does a certain trick. He puts, it's in the score. He says, after the first movement, please make a 5-minute intermission, which we are not going to do.
There is no intermission.
There is no intermission, but I mean, what Mahler meant, and what is very obvious, between movement 1 and 2, you really have to catch your breath properly, because otherwise the second movement doesn't work. So, and then comes movement 3, which is pretty much with some alterations taken from a song from the cycle that Mahler wrote, the Knabenwunderhorn, which in this case is Sankt Anton to Padua preaching to the fish. And it's, if you hear the song and you hear this movement that we are playing tonight, you recognize it's exactly the same music, minus the singer, and some bars that he wrote additionally. And then comes actually the most intimate, this kind of, let's stop for 5 minutes music, Urlicht. Urlicht is a piece that Mahler wrote during the time, it's a song. It's a song that Mahler wrote during the time he was writing his Symphony No. 2. And it's a very intimate, very, very quiet, very slow, and somewhat also a little bit naive music about, that gives you already a hint towards eternal life, let's put it that way. And it's the fact that it is slightly naive is very clearly Mahlerian. That is something that Mahler is pretty much in every piece that he writes, this kind of wonderful childlike approach to some topics. And then comes movement number 5 that hits you so over the head when it starts. And then it takes, I don't know, I don't look at it and think, oh, minute number 12, 13, 14, but probably around, I don't know, 15 minutes at least, until finally the choir sings.
They have to sit there and wait that whole time.
So this is typical for Mahler in his symphonies number 2 and 3, that you have the stage full of choristers, and they have to sit there for well over an hour without moving, don't play video games, etc., and then sing. And the difference between 2 and 3, 3 we did last season, and it's only female chorus with children, is you sit there and you're a little bit stiff, and then you actually get up and sing bim, bum, and it's like, oh, wow, fine. And in this symphony, I just look at it from the point of view of a singer. You sit there 70 minutes, 75 minutes, and then the first thing you have to sing is, that's soft.
Do you have them still sitting at that point?
Yes.
Ah, so would I.
Yeah. Yeah, that is because I read once upon a time in the many materials that I read that actually Mahler once did that and liked it. Meaning, when does the chorus stand up? And it's when this crescendo happens towards the end, just before all of a sudden the entire chorus rises, and then the rest is like,
when do you have the soloists come on?
After first.
After the first movement, when he wanted a break and where there is one anyway.
Yeah, I have done, this is the first time I do it after this first movement. Usually, I always did it like probably most of us conductors after second. But I thought that actually the progression is great if you do first movement, then you really like let it go. And then 2, 3, 4, 4 and 5 are connected anyway. 3 to 4, you should not let the audience cough. I mean, so there is only 2, and no. It should be one thing.
How many times have you conducted Mahler's Second Symphony?
I have no idea.
Yeah. Which symphony of his have you done the most?
I have no idea.
He just doesn't keep track of this kind of stuff. He's working on the next thing.
I think...
Your autobiography is going to be damn dull, buddy.
I am very aware of that because I cannot fill it with... And then I conducted for the 37th time this... I don't know. I don't know.
There's one Mahler symphony you have not performed.
Yeah, that's fine.
But
I always say that. I
have
always
a plan.
Say, fine. No.
I want to make it happen.
Okay.
All right.
I mean, if you want to make it happen, fine, but...
It'll take some investors to do Mahler's 8th. It's expensive, okay, see? Well, we have a few. It's a start.
Yeah, but, you know...
Next year, you'll end with the 7th.
Yeah.
That'll be fun.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of cowbells. Mm-hmm. Who was more neurotic, Mahler or Tchaikovsky?
Oh, Mahler.
Yeah, okay.
Well, Mahler. In his music. I don't know, but because, poor Tchaikovsky tried to kill himself.
May have succeeded. Tchaikovsky was a big fan of Mahler. Brahms, too, also saw Mahler conduct and was very impressed.
Well, Mahler was such a... Mahler is something complete... It's something else.
Yeah.
Because you have, first of all, because we talked at the beginning about Hans von Bülow, one of the greatest pianists and conductor. Let's just remember, Mahler one of the greatest composer at his time, probably more known for conducting. One of the greatest conductor. One of the, at least for us who speak German, one of the most famous quotes that we kind of get hammered in when we are students is by Mahler, which it's actually only 3 words. In German it is Tradition ist Schlamperei. Now I know that I'm getting in trouble because how on earth am I going to translate Schlamperei? You will help.
I don't know. Ich weiß nicht.
So Tradition, tradition, and Schlamperei is when you actually like do things, but not so exact. And come on, we have done it 35 times, and
Don't take tradition too seriously.
Yeah, just because, come on, we have played it 20 times. What? Don't bother rehearsing. We know how it goes. That's Schlamperei. Mahler said that.
It's not your style.
Well, yeah, but I told you, it gets hammered into our heads back in Vienna. It's something we read, and at least for me, it's something that I always remember. And it's not because that's the reason why it doesn't exist. It simply exists because when you actually are such a, let's call it a blessed fellow like I am, and you can conduct, and you conduct interesting pieces, etc., then it happens to you, at least I will speak about my experience, that every time you revisit a piece, and I'm not talking about Mahler 2, because how many Mahler 2s did I conduct? 15? I don't know. Something. But then how many performances of Dvorak 9, New World, have I conducted? Over 50? I have no idea, but well over. Something like that. And you could actually think, well, the 48th time you just phone it in. But in my thinking, there is, I'm still like, wow. I remember, because, I mean, it's long ago, but I remember that I conducted probably in 3 years, around 30, 35 performances of Magic Flute. And I mean, if you're allowed to conduct Magic Flute, you're not going to be an idiot and say like, ugh, ugh. No, you give it all, not because you try to be an ethical musician, just because you know that this is one of the greatest pieces ever written. So it's Dvorak 9 or Mahler 2, and you are just, as we say in German, you are this small with a hat on.
Not much ego here, but tons of talent and a really good attitude and a great concert tonight, and there's no intermission. It's Mahler's second. Glad you're here. Carlos Kalmar.
Robert McBride.